Good afternoon, everyone. My presentation will basically be talking a little bit about key populations in the context of HIV and TB. KELIN already mentioned quite a lot on TB, and she probably is a lot more knowledgeable about this than me, but I will try to make some connections because I think there are certain intersectionalities that need to be spoken about. I'm going to take it from the very basics, just assuming that not everybody in the room necessarily engages with key populations. So some of you have the permission to sleep through a few of the slides, but then wake up for the other ones. I asked for 2 hours to talk about this. I was given 20 minutes, so this will be a very sort of basic introduction. So to start with, defining key populations, and I put here the definition that is provided by the Global Fund in one of their documents on here, just as a start, and it says simply that key populations are groups that experience both increased impact from one of the diseases, in the case of the Global Fund that would be HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria, and decreased access to services. It also includes groups that are criminalized or otherwise marginalized. Now, of course, the criminalized part is going to be an aspect that is important to our discussion, but what I found with these definitions is that it doesn't say much. What does it mean, otherwise marginalized? What does it mean, increased impact and decreased access? So what I dragged up is from their Key Population Action Plan. They actually have 3 criteria according to which the Global Fund looks at key populations and vulnerable populations that actually I find explains a little bit more what they specifically mean with key populations. The first one is, it simply says increased risk, vulnerability, and burden and related to either biological, socioeconomical, or structural factors. I shorted some of the points because they were very verbose. The second one talks about access to relevant services being significantly lower than the rest of the population. But there's a third one that I want to pay attention to in this presentation because it says the group faces frequent human rights violations, systematic disenfranchisement, social and economic marginalization and/or criminalization, which increases vulnerability and risk and reduces access to essential services. And I think a combination of understanding key populations as being more vulnerable because of biological, socioeconomic, and structural factors, as well as understanding the key link between why someone is part of a key population and because of the human rights violations that they face is very important. Because I think we often talk about key populations, whether it's HIV, TB, malaria, as this group of people who are more vulnerable. But we must never forget that the key point why they're more vulnerable is structural barriers, it's human rights. So who are key populations? So I'm going to go over the list very quickly, and these are not comprehensive lists, but I want to sort of give an overview about sort of globally and regionally who are considered key populations. In terms of HIV, the 4 most common groups that are cited usually, and I think these are the 4 official, quote-unquote, official key populations listed by the Global Fund currently, are men who have sex with men, people who inject drugs, transgender persons, and sex workers. I think some other people, some other agencies, they exclude the sex worker, the transgender person part. For some reason, I think you'll find a lot of variation about how it's framed and which groups are included and excluded. Because in other documents, you'll find that either prisoners are included as well, even migrants. Some people, instead of people who inject drugs, say more broadly people who use drugs in order to have a more comprehensive group included. In other cases, women as a group in general are included as a key population. And in others, they also list adolescent girls. And in some national documents, I've seen a list that is as long as my 2 arms in terms of who is a key population. And that shows to say that 2 things. One, who is a key population in the context of which specific issue in which specific country is determined by 2 things. It's determined by the local context, and it is determined by the political will and the advocacy of organizations in the country. It's important to understand that because someone is not listed as a key population in a Global Fund document or in a national strategic plan in your country, that doesn't mean that they are not, quote unquote, a key population. That doesn't mean that they do not face specific issues in terms of HIV. It just simply means that for some particular reason, whether it's political, or whether it's local, that these groups have not been included. For example, in a country where same-sex practices are criminalized, you'll find a lot of political resistance to include men who have sex with men in specific documents. That doesn't mean that they're not a key population, it simply means that political will is not there to include them. So that's important to understand. And sometimes this distinction is made between key populations and vulnerable populations. The Global Fund does this, for example. I'm not a very big fan of that because I think creating a bit of a hierarchy between different groups is not necessarily the best way to go. I've personally found that a comprehensive understanding of groups who are vulnerable, marginalized, who are key populations is necessary. But the Global Fund essentially says you have 4 key populations and then we list all of the other more vulnerable groups as vulnerable populations. And I think the main reason is because the amount of key populations that were being listed according to some people was being too long and they wanted to reduce it and then create another sort of category that's sort of more comprehensive. I think we also need to be a bit critical. Okay, my position is the Regional Key Population Program Officer, but I am in myself critical about the term key populations. They are named in various ways where we call them inadequately serviced populations, marginalized grouped vulnerable populations, key populations, key affected populations, underserviced populations. Essentially, we're talking about similar concepts, about similar groups, about people who are facing human rights violations for similar reasons often, and that the core of it is the same. They are more vulnerable to certain human rights abuses, to certain issues within the context of HIV, as well as tuberculosis. And I think we shouldn't be too stuck on that language. I think that language changes depending on who gets to write a document sometimes, or who is sitting in the room deciding that. So key populations in this case, but if you hear other terminology, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a completely different concept. In terms of tuberculosis, I listed a few groups that are sometimes included. KELIN, in her presentation in the morning, actually listed several of these as well and was a bit more comprehensive about it. But the most often you'll see cited is prisoners and incarcerated people, people living with HIV, migrants, refugees, indigenous people, people who use drugs, and others. And I want to just mention here is that you do see a clear overlap between key populations for HIV and key populations for tuberculosis, as well as the fact that every person who has HIV, many of which are key populations for HIV, sex workers, trans people, men who have sex with men, are considered to be key populations in terms of TB because they are immunosuppressed. So you see that there is a large overlap between the two issues. But what is most important for me to understand is that we have all of these groups, which is great. And a lot of these groups are included due to advocacy by local grassroots organizations who say it's important to pay more attention to certain groups who face human rights violations. You cannot assume that a transgender person faces the same issues as someone who's not transgender in terms of HIV or TB. You can't assume that a prisoner will face the same issues or is vulnerable in the same way. But what is important, as I pointed out, is that you see overlap. But you don't just see overlap between the two groups of key populations, but we need to understand is that there are cross-cutting factors between the different key populations as well. This is also from the Global Fund, which sort of highlights the fact that when we talk about women and girls in their diversity who are vulnerable to, who are marginalized, more marginalized, and as a result more vulnerable to HIV, that includes transgender women. So there you have an overlap between a group, two different key populations, and that shows that you can't necessarily treat each key population in a silo. Say it's like we're going to have programs and do something for transgender people, and we'll do something for women and girls, and these two things are completely separate. Every program in terms of key populations needs to speak to each other. All of these issues essentially speak to each other because they come from the same place. As I said in the definitions earlier, as I showed them, they come from a place of human rights violations. They come from a place of stigma and discrimination. Now, yes, the type of stigma and discrimination might be the same, but in understanding that these populations overlap, we need to have a more complex understanding rather than thinking about each of these groups in isolation. As I said, they don't exist in silos. Vulnerability cuts not just across key populations, but also across TB and HIV. I think it is very unfortunate that we are in a situation where we have an HIV movement and we have a TB movement, and usually you get the HIV people in the room and maybe one or two people like KELIN in the room who talk about TB, and then we mostly talk about HIV and HIV, in this context, HIV criminalization, thinking that TB, because it hasn't been overtly criminalized, is not an issue yet, forgetting that vulnerability to HIV and TB cuts across, that these are two interlinked issues. When Justice Cameron spoke about the majority of deaths in South Africa are TB related, we forget to mention often that those TB deaths are often due to co-infection with HIV, which means is the fact that HIV deaths in South Africa are lower than TB deaths actually portrays a skewed picture. Co-infection between HIV and TB is a real issue. And it is especially a real issue when it comes to key populations. And it's even more so in the understanding that key populations intersect. If you have a migrant sex worker who's illegally in another country, and migrants are considered to be a key population for TB, and they're a sex worker and thus more at risk for HIV, and they're transgender, more at risk for HIV, and they're a drug user because they're living on the streets and they need to cope, and they're more vulnerable because of that to HIV and TB. You see the compounding amounts of human rights violations, but also the compounding vulnerability to both HIV and TB. And without looking at this, we are going to never properly address sort of the intersecting issue between HIV and TB. So in the context of thinking about criminalization of HIV and TB, we need to start also thinking about how does criminalization of HIV going to affect the explosion of TB infections? If we understand, and this has been mentioned, if HIV criminalization, if HIV-specific laws that criminalize HIV exposure, transmission, etc., if they pose a barrier to getting an HIV test, and thus also a barrier to HIV services and being able to keep yourself safe as an HIV-positive person because you don't know, you know that you're less likely to be able to understand that you're also more at risk for TB. And if you create a situation where the HIV, essentially that there is less drive for people to be able to get tested, be able to take care of themselves for HIV, you're going to impact the TB rates equally as well. And if then concurrently we move towards a space, which I hope we don't, where TB gets further criminalized or gets further repressed, then we truly need to understand that criminalization of HIV and TB are inherently interlinked, because a lot of the stigma and discrimination comes from the same places, there are a lot of the same populations involved, and the issues are essentially interlinked. HIV and TB co-infections is a key element in this. So I see the chair looking at me, probably trying to make sure that I don't spend too much time. And I want to talk about that a little bit more, because criminalization of key populations, whether direct or indirect, I think it's important to understand is that key populations are not just directly criminalized. For example, transgender people are not criminalized because they are transgender. Transgender people are criminalized often because they're perceived to be a man who has sex with men. They are perceived to be a sex worker when they walk over the street in a certain way. Or they are criminalized because they are a sex worker, because a lot of transgender women do sex work because they can't get a job. So there's indirect criminalization because of who you are as well. And often the criminalization that you face as a key population is linked to the criminalization you face based on like criminalization of HIV. And I think the way I want to explain this is that overall, when you look at criminalization, in my opinion, and I'm sure people can agree with me, is I see it as a societal control through legal means. Criminalization of key populations specifically, criminalizing same-sex practices, criminalizing sex work, criminalizing certain forms of migration, criminalizing drug use, are ways in which society seeks to control certain people, seeks to control behavior, seeks to impose a certain amount of control over what is right or wrong. Now, that equally applies to criminalization of HIV. Because we all know that the stigma and discrimination you face as an HIV-positive person is rooted in the understanding that you are someone who might infect someone else. It is rooted in you posing a danger to society. In the same way that key populations such as men who have sex with men or transgender people or sex workers are seen to be a danger to society. They are seen to be, perhaps in cases of men who have sex with men, they are seen to be a danger to the moral fabric of society, while HIV positive people are considered to be a danger to the public health of society. So in both cases, these are situations where the societal well-being according to specific moral standards or specific health standards are used as an argument to exercise control and as a result take away human rights of individuals. And I want to stress this because I think this is a key element. We need to start understanding criminalization of key populations and criminalization of HIV, and by extension TB, as interlinked issues. The type of stigma and discrimination that an HIV positive person faces might be very specific to that person, but the way society treats it as a way, in essence, trying to exercise control over this person by taking away rights, is essentially rooted in the same type of societal control that people are trying to exercise, where you hear the idea where the individual's rights are essentially curtailed for quote unquote the better, the greater good, which in essence is a problematic position to start from. And I think this is something that would come back when later we have a presentation that talks about when, in which cases, and how can public health arguments be used to impede on individuals' rights. It very much links to that question. In these cases, it shouldn't, because of all, we've heard the evidence before today. And secondly, what is important to realize is that even if you look specifically at criminalization of HIV and TB, these will specifically impact key populations even more because they are more likely to be HIV positive. Not just that, they're more likely perceived to have HIV. And I think this is important. I think perceptions of HIV status play a key element in whether somebody will be prosecuted for HIV or not. The examples that were brought up this morning by Bernard, for example, a homeless person, we can't forget that this is a homeless person. We can't forget that the position this person holds is a marginalized position, and the way this person will be prosecuted is very different than if this was a middle class or an upper class businessman who spat in the face of a police officer. We cannot forget that the homeless aspect very much influences the way this case is brought. We cannot forget that when a gay man is accused of exposing someone else to HIV, the way this is dealt with is very different than if he was heterosexual. We can't forget that if a woman is accused of exposing someone to HIV, that is a very different way that society deals with that than if this was a man. And that goes across all aspects. And lastly, what I want to address is that I had another point, and I think I'm slowly losing the point. You know how that happens in your head. But what I want to address is that in order to start addressing and understanding key populations in this debate, we cannot forget that the law is not unbiased. We think about the law as an instrument that should serve all, that should be unbiased, that it should be the end of everything. But the law is very much shaped, and how the law is implemented is very much shaped by societal attitudes, by what people think, by what the masses think. And an example of this is that if you look at, for example, gay marriage in South Africa, if you ask, I think we are quite conscious of the fact that in South Africa, if you ask the majority of people in South Africa whether they agree with gay marriage, you're going to find a shocking result. The amount of violence still present in South Africa shows that the majority of society is not for gay rights, LGBTI rights, yet the law still exists that gay marriage is legal, and the reason why this is a constitutional court. And this is where I think we need to get a position where we think about the responsibility of the judiciary and the lawyers, who are not politicians, in holding the politicians to account. We need to understand that such systems essentially become a last resort in order to stem the impact of societal norms and values that will end up oppressing an individual through laws made by politicians who need votes, who have political agendas, in order to essentially protect those who are most oppressed. And in terms of HIV criminalization, this is an important aspect. If you ask an entire country, and many people say there that they support HIV criminalization, for whatever societal bias they have, whatever misunderstandings they have, it is the sworn duty of a lawyer to stand up with the judiciary to say, no, even though society and the political will is against this, for sheer human decency, we cannot let this happen. And I think this is the role that you must play when it comes to not just HIV criminalization, but in terms of criminalization of key populations or the rights of key populations in general. Thank you.